Our next panel is on BEAD and USF. I feel like I should say welcome back to the panel on BEAD and USF. We first started talking about it in 2022, and I think Brandy first joined us in either 2022 maybe, or 2023. Someday we'll stop talking about BEAD, I guess, but it's not today. So much is going on. So first, let me quickly introduce the panelists. Yes, everybody's here, good. We have Adam Cassidy, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Deputy Administrator at NTIA.
Scott, that's the old one.
What?
That's the old one.
Oh yeah, that's not you, is it?
That's not me.
No. Let me find
We have some random guy.
Stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
So,
Adam's never going to let you forget.
David. All right, there we go. You are, in fact, David Bruder,
That's correct.
Chief Counsel at NTIA. We will make sure that this is actually Janice, sitting next to him, yes. Professor of Economics at University of North Texas. Jim Prieger, who's professor at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine. And Brandy Reiter, who is the Executive Broadband Officer for the state of Colorado. So, since we have been talking about BEAD, maybe somebody could bring us up to speed about what the status of BEAD is now. What's happening at NTIA, what's happening with the states, and sort of what kind of timeline we should expect from this point. Why don't we start with you?
Sure. So, as of today, all 56 eligible entities have completed their benefit of the bargain round. So that's great progress. Really happy with that. NTIA has held 11 special award condition meetings, meaning we've discussed the preliminary results of each state's benefit of the bargain round with those 11 states. And then we've received, or there have been 3 published final proposals for public comment by the states, and one state has, an NTA has received 1 final proposal from the state, as Adam mentioned yesterday.
Brandy, from your perspective, how does this work? You started one process and you got to start again, and so where are you all with it?
Yeah, so from the state's perspective, we are all in on the process of a 90-day, basically a sub-grantee selection process, and we all have the same deadline. So for us, the state of Colorado, along with my colleagues across the country, with the benefit of the bargain round, which was announced on June 6th of this year in a public policy notice, we have 90 days to run a subrecipient process, make our selections, and run a public process, the 7-day public process on our final proposal, as David has mentioned. And so it's a tight timeline, and in large organizations, which states are, 90 days is really hard, but we're all moving through the process. I think we're prioritizing speed and moving through the process. So for all of the states, we are required to submit our final result, our final proposal to the NTIA September 4th. Most of us are all of us are on track to do that. Some of us are early, but most of my colleagues are, we're all rushing, and a lot of us, we're going to probably submit around the same time. So that's where we are with the BEAD program itself. So, and we're all making our deadlines, as the NTIA has said.
Janice, the states aren't the only ones whose work was affected by the changes. You did a lot of work scoring states. And I mean, I know we haven't been seeing that same huge level of effort again, but you've been following it. And what do you make of sort of the new rules compared to the previous rules, and how well do you think states will be able to meet them and create good?
So I actually like the new rules. I think that a lot of the objectives that we were looking for for states to follow had to do with accountability measures in their rubrics and transparency and and market-based solutions. And so we were looking for a lot of those things and for other ways that states could not require too much over-regulation requirements from their providers. And at the same time, so we did a lot of background work in looking at every state. The idea was just to kind of help guide states through best practices. One of the difficulties that we run into is that the data that I use, because I'm just an academic, I'm only looking at what's publicly available. And so a lot of the changes I do not have access to. I don't understand what happened or why it's not publicly available. And that's a little bit frustrating. For example, when Volume 2 initially would go back and forth with NTIA for their approval, and changes would be made, but it's not clear what those changes are, and there wasn't really a public forum for that information. So that kind of slowed us down in understanding what's happening. And for example, now with the eligibility, so there are reports that up to 60% of eligible locations are no longer eligible. That's also not clear. Is it because of the challenge process, or is it because they are now newly served, generally through the market process? And so there's a lot that we have not been able to look into, and so not really be particularly useful, which is frustrating. But and then I'm from Texas, and Texas is difficult right now.
Yeah. Well, wait, actually, say more.
I'll say more.
Why?
I believe Texas applied for an extension from the September 4th or 5th. I don't know what happened with that.
I don't want to say too much about that at this point.
There are, as Brandy said, there are a lot of moving parts, and it's very fast. And one of the mottos at our university, which is difficult, is as fast as possible without the wheels coming off. And that's a little bit frightening, but also exciting, because you don't want things to take forever. It's just difficult to look into. We want states to be able to hold their providers accountable for what they say they can do. And so the goal of academics who I work with is to help states do that as effectively as possible. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
If I can just,
I was just going to comment that, obviously 90 days to do all of this work is a very tight timeline, but this program's been going on for 4 years, and so it is really NTIA trying to get the money out the door as quickly as possible with, to use your term, not letting the wheels fall off as we do so. So we've really tried to balance that, and we're holding ourselves to the same tight deadlines as well. So once the final proposals actually come in, to get that money out the door and approve each state's final proposal.
Actually, Jim, just before you,
yeah, go ahead.
but David, I don't know how much you can answer this, but I mean, take us behind the scenes a little bit to what was happening at NTIA in the first few months. I mean, RAL wasn't there yet, but they were also trying to make all these changes. I mean, that must have been kind of confusing. And how did that happen?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably relatively obvious at this point, but NTIA really developed two goals. One, to make the program technology neutral so that more providers could participate and really drive home the benefit of the bargain. And a lot of that was at Secretary Lutnick's direction. So we really wanted the states to use the best tool for the job, what was going to drive home the best result for the state, for their particular locations, at the best price, to that ultimately, hopefully, save lots of money. And another way, as Janice mentioned, was, or another thing we wanted to do was remove all of the extra legal requirements that had been hamstringing the program, driving up the costs, preventing other providers from participating. Just to name a few: the open access, net neutrality requirement, the rate regulation, climate change, workforce, et cetera, et cetera. I could go out. So we really, just came in the door knowing these were the things that we wanted to do, and then just trying to figure out how to work with the previous notice of funding opportunity and make it all work.
Was it at all awkward to try to be doing these things without your administrator yet? I mean, I know there was an acting.
It definitely
who I thought was
presented-
you, right? But
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, it definitely presented challenges. Adam was great in taking the lead to drive home the processes. And again, Secretary Lutnick himself was involved. So that helped a lot to have the support of a cabinet official.
okay, Jim.
Yeah, I was just going to mention Janice and I were at a different broadband event a couple months ago, earlier this summer in DC, and there were people from the States there as well. And it was interesting, speaking of 90-day deadlines, because they were kind of course, grousing about this and the incredible amount of new work that they had to do, but they were also kind of like, yeah, but goes around, comes around. NTIA has these 90-day deadlines as well, and we don't think they're going to be able to do it, so they'll have egg on their face. So I just thought that was interesting. But just comment on the new rules. I mean, I also see it as a welcome change. Set aside the politics, just in terms of the economics. Not every government program has to try to achieve every social goal, right? And those that have try to serve four masters, climate change, diversity, and broadband expansion, you're not going to do them all well, and you don't need to do them all well in every single little program. And so I actually see it as a very welcome change, to my understanding, that the program has reoriented itself to, in a technologically neutral way, let's just try to get, push broadband out to as many new people as possible.
May I say something about the timeline? I think that also there was concern, and I would love to hear what Brandy has to say about this, but having all of the states really adhere to the same timeline, as you mentioned, because they've been doing this for 4 years, I think it's going to be hugely beneficial, simply because a lot of states are waiting, reacting for when larger states like Texas, once they're approved, where are the resources going to go? And there are only so many physical capital resources, like backhoes, right? There are only so many ditch diggers that exist, and the labor and those kinds of things, and they're all on these same time frames, and that's a needless uncertainty. And I think the less uncertainty states have, the easier it will be for them to go forward.
Yeah, I have a few just observations and perspectives, and really just coming from the states. And I work with my colleagues every week to, work with the NTIA, digest the old rules, the new rules, and the reality of the program. And I know there's welcome change, and I want to highlight that. I think the old program was trying to be too many things to too many people, and we got bogged down in 3.5 years of making sure everybody got what they wanted. And what it really ended up being was an exercise in some of the most bureaucratic processes I've ever seen in my career. And I've been in the public sector for 25 years now. And I think it was just a classic case of good intentions just not meeting its full potential. And I want to say that because I don't think the last version of BEAD was bad. And I think what it taught us was we have priorities as a country. States have priorities as a country. The states were really in the driver's seat during the last BEAD program. And the benefit of the bargain round is not a state-driven approach. It is a top-down approach. And that's fine. If that's what we're doing, that's okay. States can pivot, and my colleagues are very motivated to connect people to high-speed internet. So if this is what we're doing, we're fine with that. But we don't have the ability in the program to really work and collaborate with our stakeholders like we did last time. And those collaborations really result in good public policy, good infrastructure builds, infrastructure that's going to be resilient, that's going to be sustainable over time. And so, we've gone from a state-driven approach, which takes a lot longer, and good public policy takes a little while. Quick fixes, they're quick, but it doesn't always result in the outcomes that maybe you had intended. So there's a little bit of a pros and cons here, and yes, the good result, all the regulations, all the bureaucracy, shot clocks. States were asking the NTIA for years for shot clocks because we would send stuff to the NTIA and it would just go into a black hole, and we would hear 6 months later, and after 6 months there would be versions and versions of it. But I want to highlight that there are good things about the old program. There's good things about the benefit of the bargain round. But I also want to give my states, I want to give the states credit because we spent 3.5 years, and before the benefit of the bargain round, most of us were done with our subrecipient selection process. The state of Colorado was done. We were done in April of this year. And we buttoned up our program just like a lot of states. Some of the states were a little bit further, they were a little bit behind, but we were all tracking ahead. So most of us, and there were three final proposals that were approved last year. And so when we talk about speed to deployment, I just want to highlight and give the states credit for moving quickly in a framework that wasn't set up for success in terms of moving quickly. And so we powered through it, but most of us were done. And also, you know, in terms of like putting all the states on the same timeline, what I liked about the staggered approach, and a lot of states took advantage of it, some of us, we had different strategies. We were all kind of assessing the resources available. And for the state of Colorado, we were one of the early adopters. We were in the top 5. We were trying so hard not to be on the same page as everybody else because we would have had more access to labor. We would have had more access to supply chains. And we were actually communicating with suppliers across the world, telling them when they could expect to deploy broadband in Colorado. And so, you know, there was a whole planning piece that was actually, and it's really hard to have all the stars aligned, but they were all going to hit at the right time. And we were working with our providers and workforce and really setting ourselves up for kind of go time in 2025. And so, yes, we prioritized the speed, but speed for us, you know, was continuing, but we had to start over. And so it's really, 90 days is really hard. I can't even do a procurement in my agency in 90 days. You know, add 10 months to that, right? And so do the wheels feel like they're coming off? I would say no. But, you know, I think we'll get through this. And yes, will some of this money flow a little bit sooner? Yes, for some of the states that were really far behind or sitting on the sidelines, yes. But for some of us, this money would have already been out the door.
You know, actually, just as an aside, one of the interesting things about all of this is that, you know, one of the big lessons from economics is that you should ignore sunk costs when making your decisions going forward. And so that's what we should be doing here. But economics says nothing about how annoyed that can make you with all the work that you put into it.
Well, and government does it all the time. I mean, we always redo and redo and redo. And it's very hard to get to a point of impact. And I've seen this in many, many industries, many projects. And when we talk about, you know, waste and efficiencies, you know, we really need to take a deep look at what we're doing from a public perspective. State of Colorado included, so we're not innocent either.
No, I would just say that, you know, we've definitely appreciate all the work that the states have been doing and how difficult their position is to go and run another round of funding opportunity. But, you know, when we came in and we looked at the numbers that from the previous administration for some of the final proposals, they were just too outrageous for us to move forward with the program. And so we really felt like, even though this might, you know, set us back a few months, in the long run, this was best for the American taxpayer and for the American people, and best use of funds. So.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Janice.
I'm wondering, as an academic, what are the quantifiable changes following the benefit of the bargain round? And will that, I know you have that, but is that something that we will get?
It's something I will take back
Publicly
and see
avail?
what we could do.
Because
for sure.
because then you'll know if it was
Right.
if all this slowdown was worth it, right? Whether it was an efficient use of time and money.
I can say that
You
from
said
what
yes.
we've seen so far, we have definitely seen that the benefit of the bargain round is working in terms of the cost savings per location.
Good.
I don't want to get
No.
too far ahead and
Yeah.
spike the football yet, but, you know, hopefully that's a good sign for things to come.
So I don't really know where the initial $42 billion number came from, why they chose that. But the amount, you know, 4 years or 5 years in terms of broadband development is a lot of time. How much, if we were to redesign this program now, what would be a reasonable budget for it? Or you could say we shouldn't have the program too, that's a legitimate response. But we're still talking about the same amount of money, a lot of it's been inflated away, but still, where?
I'd love to hear what the economists have to say about this.
So the economists have an easy answer that's completely useless, which is the marginal benefit of the last dollar we spent on broadband should be equal to the marginal benefit of its next best use, right? So that's the question. Is the 42nd and first billionth dollar giving us the same bang for the social buck as if we took that dollar and spent it towards anything else that we could spend it on, right? So it's pretty easy to come up with, well, I think it would be pretty easy to come up with some other social needs where you might get a greater bang for that buck. There's difference of opinion there, facts come into play. But yeah, so that's the useless, unhelpful argument from the economist. I mean, clearly these are political decisions, right? I mean, they're informed by economics, but economists don't get to make these decisions. But that's what you would, that would be the way to think about it, right? It's not just, what do you get for $40 billion? Is that good, yes or no? You have to keep in mind the opportunity costs. And the fact that cost of social funds, the social cost to raise $1 is not $1 to society, right? There's deadweight loss, there's inefficiency. This money is coming from somewhere. It's through, necessarily inefficient taxation, and so you have to just, this wraps into the whole question of the whole scale of federal spending.
And we'll definitely come to that, back to that when we're talking about USF support, how to fund USF. Now there's another hard question, which is how do we make sure that the companies or the providers that win funds don't just come back in a couple of years and say, hey, now we need more money. We need money for OpEx. I mean, they're already saying that in some cases. Are we just building up an even bigger claim on universal service funds? And is there anything possible to do about it? I mean, nobody's really solved this problem since Williamson's article in the 70s. So it's kind of unfair to ask you to solve it right now, but solve it right now.
I mean, I can tell you that, from our perspective, that's what, I don't want to say it was a goal of the program, but trying to use the right technology at the right location, not fund extravagant locations with extravagant technology, or not necessarily extravagant locations, but, very hard to serve locations with specific technology types, which is going to raise the cost to the provider, and then they're going to have to recoup those costs later on. We really did not want to do that, and that's what we were hoping to drive with the benefit of the bargain around, lower the cost, and then hopefully reduce or eliminate a subsidy at a later point. Now, whether that can be done, I would once again defer to my economist friends.
Well, let's hear from Brandy.
And I think when we talk about BEAD preventing providers from coming back and with their hands out to continue subsidizing hard to reach locations, I don't think BEAD is going to prevent that, and which means we'll all be up here over the next 10 years talking about this same subject. And honestly, I don't know if public policy and the way we design our broadband programs at the state level and nationally will ever prevent that. And there's a couple of reasons why, and I'll stick to BEAD. I mean, we have some issues in our state broadband program that we're learning from, and we're trying to prevent future subsidies. But when we look at technology, when you invest in one-time technology and not permanent infrastructure, you do have to refresh that technology. You have to upgrade it, and you end up paying for it multiple times over and over again. And when you base it off of performance standard that, quite frankly, was a performance standard that was sufficient 10, 15 years ago, and you're looking at scalability, you are always going to be in the business of funding broadband. And so broadband technologies, there's technologies that stand the test of time much better than others. I do think all technology has a space across the country, especially in Colorado. We have always been a technology-neutral shop. In our BEAD program, round 1, round 2, and the benefit of the bargain round, we had every technology participate. And we continue to see that in our state broadband program. And so preventing future subsidies, I don't think BEAD is going to accomplish that. I just don't, because we're investing in lower cost technology, but lower cost technology means that you have to pay for those upgrades, you have to pay to refresh the technology. Fiber is permanent infrastructure, you don't have to replace it. The same fiber that's in the ground today, it was built 20 years ago, is still there. Is it expensive? Yes, absolutely. But studies have shown that when you invest in fiber, it's a lot cheaper over the long run. Yes, fixed wireless, LEO, unlicensed fixed wireless, yes, those are viable solutions, but you have to keep investing over and over again.
I would also mention, just kind of to draw back a little bit from the specifics, this is a problem that regulators face and that the government will face in many different aspects. So this is just part of what an economist would call a dynamic commitment problem or principal agent problem with the dynamic element. Things are changing over time and there's asymmetric information between the firms. Government has an objective, firm has the knowledge. How do you bring those two together with that limited information? One of the insights from the economic literature here is that what you can't do is just tell the regulators to buck up and be firm when they come back, because of that time inconsistency problem. It's hard to commit your future self to saying no when you know your future self will face political pressures. So what you have to do is work to change the incentives for the firms to come back and ask for more at the beginning. And to its credit, I think both the old and the new form of BEAD have done some of that, right? So there's some long-term contracting and obligations built into these things, like just thinking about, I noticed that there's a 10-year LEO subgrantee provision in the revised BEAD rules saying, this is what you have to do for this many years. Other things you can do, you can levy the competitive threat and say, okay, if you come back, maybe that will trigger either penalties or that will trigger, reopening everything up to your competition as well as you, just to provide disincentives for firms to do that. And of course, you can't completely solve these problems because the asymmetric information problem is fundamental and it changes over time. As you mentioned, you can't perfectly future-proof, but you can do some things to mitigate some of that risk.
Let's pivot to USF, and Jim, let's stick with you, because you just have one of the biggest issues in USF is how do we pay for it? The first question should be how much should we be paying for it, but let's skip over that for now. Jim, talk about that question of funding it, just because you probably got the most recent paper.
Yes, so the good folks at Digital Progress Institute asked me quite a while ago, even though the report was just released 2 weeks ago, to look at some of the economic analysis involved with ways we might reform USF funding. And I know a lot of you in this room probably know more about USF than I do, but perhaps if you don't, let me just mention, this is a program on the order of $8.5 billion in recent years. It's funded through what I'll just call legacy telecom services. So if you make, this language sounds so 1990s. If you make an interstate telephone call, that is in the revenue base for this. I'll just call it a tax. It's not legally a tax, but I'm an economist. It's a contribution rate levied on revenue, so to me it's a tax. It's a tax. Yes. So the problem is not so much that the fund needs have grown. So since 2012, we basically had flat spending. It's just that the revenue base has been shrinking steadily since at least 2008. And so what was roughly a 10% tax in 2000 is now pushing a 35% tax most recently. What other goods in the US economy are taxed at those rates? It's like sin goods like tobacco. So do we want to be taxing telecom at that level? Pretty much everyone thinks not. Okay, so what do you do? So setting aside, so I don't get into the question at all of how much should we spend. Let's just say that we want to fund about $8 or $8.5 billion. What can you do? So the answer is, of course, expand the base. Now, this is where the microeconomics teacher in me dearly would love to show you a graph with tax revenue and deadweight loss. But just briefly, the inefficiency of a tax like this is, roughly speaking, going to be rising with the square of the tax rate. Not linearly, but with the square. In other words, you really want to keep the tax rate as low as possible for a more socially efficient system. And the way you do that, of course, is by making the base, that which you are taxing, as large as possible. Okay, so what did I consider in the report? Pretty much anything that people talk about. So at the extreme end, you could say, well, let's stop having FCC and USAC funding this themselves. You could just push this as a general obligation to the US taxpayer. And then, of course, the funding base becomes huge, and the tax rate would be very low. Potential problem with that is that income is already heavily taxed. Well, it's taxed, and so this is not, and so the inefficiency, actually, you're adding to a lot of existing inefficiency. That may or may not be the best thing to do. But so what other things have people proposed? So the shortest step from the status quo would just be to tax broadband service revenues, which are not currently part of the funding base. If you just did that, the tax rate would fall to about 3%, and your inefficiency, your deadweight loss, would fall by 2 orders of magnitude. Okay, so that's a short way of saying if you do anything else than status quo, we can argue about the details, but anything else would be a huge and vast improvement. Just briefly, and then I'll be quiet, at least for a while. What else could you tax? So there are other aspects of the digital ecosystem, the players that have benefited enormously from the existence of the internet without directly contributing much to its creation. Digital ads, cloud computing, streaming, platform agency revenue. These would be the Amazons, the eBays, the Ubers of the world. Possibly e-commerce. You could, as a thought experiment, you could think about taxing all of that. Although you probably wouldn't want to do that because that, of course, is already subject to sales tax. And you can read the report. You can look it up on Digital DPI's website if you're interested in these details. But I have some things that look better than others, but really I almost don't want to get into that. It's really just if we do anything other than the status quo, it will be, that's 95% of the gains will come from that.
Janice, is this something you've thought about also? I'm just asking as the other economist, so I don't feel,
So,
I don't want to put you on the spot.
yes, and all my thoughts after reading Jim's work, I think, yeah, well, he wins. So the only, going in a slightly different direction, mostly because I am equally uncertain about things that I've read that say some locations are going to be twice or thrice served or have more than enough money, and then others aren't going to have anything, and just based on eligible and ineligible locations that are newly identified, and thinking about if there is, so there's this debate about what do we do if there's extra money, and there's a simultaneous debate happening, we don't have enough money. And so in trying to figure out those two parts, who thinks what and why do they believe that to be true, is the question that I've been thinking about. And then if there is more money, what do we do with that? So I've gone in that direction instead of we don't have enough, and looked at what do we do if there is more?
And?
Well, I think a lot of the things that were taken out that are important to states and particularly local areas that were taken out of the requirements but are near and dear to some states are their own individual local affordability and digital literacy programs and things like that that are better at the local level anyway. So a lot of the things that were not mandated at the state level anymore can still be considered. There's still a window of opportunity for those services to be made available if the communities.
So without trying to put words in anyone's mouth, this is sort of the point you were making, Brandy, right? That there were things that were good at the state level.
Yeah, there was a lot of things that were good and are still good. And to your point, Janice, when we look at, internet adoption, there's infrastructure, but there's a whole half of it that is required. There's, like for state of Colorado, I'll just point out, 50% of our adoption issues are infrastructure. The other 50% are non-deployment activities, and when we look at our federal programs, They have mainly been focused on the infrastructure. And when we restructure BEAD, a lot of states did have, when they had money left over because they were able to achieve some savings, or it didn't cost as much, or the broadband, the national broadband map changed, and that there was a reduction in the number of broadband serviceable locations that needed a subsidy. And a lot of states had said, well, if we have money left over, this is what we would do. We would fund workforce. We would skill people up to use the internet, skill people up in the trades, mainly in rural America, to create high-paying jobs that support these deployments, and teach people how to use the internet, train them for a modern economy. The other piece of it was digital. We don't call it digital equity in Colorado, we call it digital access, because it really is access. It's looking at your gaps, determining why that is, so it's devices, it's education, it's can I afford the internet? And so a lot of states did craft really, really great plans, which are, for me, have become best practices and models for what you do when you do have funds left over. And on rare occasions, you do. Like Colorado, when we came to BEAD, we had no money left over. We didn't even have enough money to fully fund every location in Colorado underneath the old program. But a lot of states had really great plans. And so I think there's a real opportunity to really balance it out between infrastructure and the non-deployment activities that are critical to make sure that when you do spend $42 billion, that people will connect. Because in government, again, and I can say this because this has been my career, we do a lot of, if they build it, they will come. And that is not the case. You can build a lot of things, and if you don't take a comprehensive approach, people aren't going to connect. And we've seen this over and over again. And I think there's a real opportunity with USF and some of the state programs, including ours. We expanded the uses of eligibility, the entities that can apply. We expanded everything so that we could take a comprehensive approach to digital access in Colorado.
We should take some questions. I don't know if there are any questions about broadband of a breakfast variety, maybe. No, yeah, go ahead. Wait for the mic.
Yeah, hi, Jeff Baumgartner with Light Reading. I had a quick question for Brandy. You had mentioned that every technology participated in the benefit of the bargain round. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much you can say at this point, but did you see like a big shift in changes in interest from other, like if we're talking about non-fiber stuff like satellite, fixed wireless, or even HFC versus the original process? I mean, anything anecdotal you can share at this point about the mix?
Yeah, I can share. I'm not going to share pricing because I don't want to get in trouble. I think that'd be a bad deal. Because we have to meet with the NTI on Friday, and I want to. So I was. Yeah. So hopefully everything works out on Friday, David. We still have much love for the NTIA. So So we did see a pretty big shift between the original program and the benefit of the bargain round. And under the old program, we had a tech mix of 70% fiber in Colorado and 30% fixed wireless in Leo. Unlicensed fixed wireless wasn't, they did not apply at the time. They were not considered an eligible technology under the old program. That's what we had under the old program. And it was always going to be that way in Colorado. We were never going to get fiber everywhere. I never thought we were. I thought we would get 98% back when I was optimistic and dewy-eyed and like all the things. But reality kicked me in the teeth, and I was like, okay, this is not going to happen. But the opportunity is we're going to get as many people connected as possible, and we're really going to sharpen our pencils. Our providers showed up. They met us where we needed them to meet them on the budget, the cost per passing, and I was really impressed. Under the current program, the benefit of the bargain round, because it prioritizes, it takes a cost-based approach, which is the lowest bid for these locations. We're actually kind of looking at a tech mix of around 60% Leo and fixed wireless, mostly Leo. We have about 130,000 locations available in the BEAD program, and about 60 to 70,000 will be Leo, and then and fiber will be the rest. So we we actually saw an inverse of the result from the previous program. And so Leo really was aggressive in our BOB round. They were still aggressive in the last round, but more aggressive on pricing, more aggressive in how many locations they serve. They bid on every location except for 6 in the state. Not sure why those 6 didn't get a bid, but we'll figure that out later. But we saw an inverse of that in our benefit of the bargain round. So it'll result in us not having enough money to do the program, to maybe potentially giving back maybe 200, 300, 400 million back to the feds. So we had an original allocation of 800 million, actually 826 million, but 800 million for deployment. So the benefit of the bargain round did achieve its mission of saving money and making sure that we're spending as least amount as possible to get the most coverage, which we will. We will coverage more locations in Colorado because of it. But it'll be a lot less, and so we did see a little bit of a decrease from the round 1 and round 2 to the benefit of the bargain round. That was mainly in fiber providers, but we did see an uptick in a pretty significant uptick in fixed wireless and Leo. So it was kind of like the pendulum swung the other way. So that's kind of the before and after when you compare the two.
So I think that's, we have to leave it there. Looking forward to next year's panel when we can actually answer some of these questions. Why did this happen? Why did that happen? That I think will be fascinating. Thank you all so much. This is really good. It's really interesting. We're going to take a quick break and be back at 9:45 for a panel on privacy and government surveillance. Because it's on surveillance, we'll know where you are. And this will be a panel led by the always amazing Shane Tews. You'll want to be here for that.